In today's video, we're going to continue on with our coverage covering all 31 NHL teams, recapping their 17-18 season, and looking ahead to the 2018 offseason, discussing what we should expect from these teams and how do they improve moving forward into next season. Today's team we're discussing is the Columbus Blue Jackets, and that's coming up next. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams, so if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. So as I mentioned off the top, today we're covering the Columbus Blue Jackets, and we're going to recap their 17-18 season and discuss what we're looking forward to here in the 2018 offseason. We'll have a look at all this team's cap space, contracts, and how do they move forward and get better moving into next season. First of all, though, let's jump into recapping the 17-18 season. Now, obviously, they ended up making the playoffs as a wildcard team. The Blue Jackets finished with a 45-30-7 record for 97 points, putting them into a wildcard spot for the playoffs. Obviously, they ended up losing in the first round to the eventual Stanley Cup champions, the Washington Capitals. The Blue Jackets were up 2-0 in that series and got off to a great start, but then the Capitals came roaring back and took the series from them. And it's an unfortunate ending for the Blue Jackets as they really had a good start to that series. So let's jump into some of the team and individual statistics for the year to kind of break things down that went well and not so well. Now, they ended up scoring 236 goals for, put them at 17th in the league, so just right below the midway point. So not fantastic, but not terrible. Goals against was 226, which put them in 10th place, which is pretty solid. If you can be top 10, that's usually a pretty respectable place to be. So they did pretty well preventing the puck out of the net, so that wasn't too bad. The power play was not very good at all, 17.2%. And the PK was 76.2 for 27th place. So both special teams areas were at the bottom of the league, 25th and 27th respectively. So those are big areas of focus for next year. Special teams were not kind to the Blue Jackets this past season. Another stat that was not in the Blue Jackets' favors was face-off wins. They ranked 26th in the league with a percentage of 48.4%. When you're starting to play a high percentage of the time, and in their case more than 50% of the time without the puck, that's going to make your job that much more difficult. It's amazing that they ranked so well in goals against, even though their face-off percentage was not great. A lot of times those kind of go hand in hand, especially when you're losing a lot of defensive zone face-offs. Often that can certainly lead to more goals against than they would like. So it's certainly another area of focus between face-offs, PK, power play. It's amazing that even though they get themselves into a wild card spot, that they had all these other statistics that really weren't overly favorable. Now let's jump into some of the bright spots here for the team for the year. We'll look at it in more of an individual player basis, and we'll kind of make sense as to how this ended up the way it was. Now, if you look at some guys that had great seasons, we can start with Artemi Panarin. Obviously, there was a lot of question marks as to how he'd fit in Columbus after starting his career with Chicago, playing a lot with Patrick Kane. There was a lot of people that were skeptical. Maybe, would he be as good without Kane? Would Kane still be as good without Panarin? Because they were like magic together. But you know what? He did quite well, and he put up 82 points in 81 games. So Panarin obviously is good enough on his own. It doesn't really matter who he plays with. He's a top-end player, and he produced quite well for the Blue Jackets this year. Another really player who had a great year was Pierre-Luc Dubois. Really broke out as potentially to be their long-term top center iceman here. He certainly has that capability. Scored 20 goals. He had a really solid year. There's certainly some question marks around him. I know a lot of people were surprised a few years back when the Blue Jackets selected him with the number 3 overall pick in the draft. He was a player that was expected to go in the first round, but not quite that high. The Blue Jackets really wanted to target a top center. They kind of went off the board and took him. And so far, it's looking like it's going to pay off. He certainly looks like he has a bright future for sure with the Blue Jackets. Now, a couple of their top defensive pairing had a phenomenal year between Seth Jones and Zach Werenski. Seth Jones is working his way into the Norris Trophy conversation, and over the next few years, I can certainly see him at the very least being a candidate, if not a winner. Seth Jones ended up putting up a 57-point season and +10 rating and was an absolute beast in the back end for the Blue Jackets. Zach Werenski put up 16 goals for the Blue Jackets as well. So between the two, they certainly provided a lot of good defense and a lot of offense from the back end as well. So the Blue Jackets are pretty set with their top pair back there on defense. And obviously goaltender Sergei Bobrovsky had a really solid year as well. He has been pretty solid for them. Hasn't gotten it done yet in the playoffs, which is certainly a question mark on his resume, but his regular season play has been fantastic. Bobrovsky finished this year with a 37, 22, and 6 record, with a 2.42 goals against average and a 921 save percentage. Those types of numbers are pretty solid. It's not going to get you into the Vezina conversation this year, but really that's not anything to be upset about. Bobrovsky has given this team solid goaltending throughout the regular season for a number of years now. But like I said, unfortunately, he needs to get the job done in the playoffs. But certainly their playoff loss this year, I don't think you can blame just Bobrovsky. There was a lot of other things that factored into that. But at the end of the day, that's kind of what's missing on his resume. But they do always get solid goaltending from Bob. Now, as far as things that were not so bright for the Blue Jackets this year, unfortunately, there are many of them. In my opinion, the Blue Jackets really relied really heavily on their top players this year. Like, they were getting some good production from Jones and Werenski. They're some of their top guys, like Panarin, were producing well. But they really had a lot of guys that kind of had mediocre seasons, or their production was tailing off in the wrong direction. So let's take a look at some of those guys. I mean, Alex Wennberg only put up 8 goals. That's a disappointing season for Wennberg. He really didn't produce at the level that everybody thought he would. Marcus Foligno went from 26 goals the year before down to 15. So, I mean, obviously that's a big drop off for Foligno. Atkinson went from 34 the year before, gets a big contract extension, drops down to 24. I mean, Atkinson certainly had his struggles this year, was hurt a little bit too. So it wasn't a fantastic year for Atkinson. Thankfully he did get us the numbers up to 24. At one point in the year, it was looking like he wouldn't hit that either. So he did finish a little bit stronger. But still, for the contract that he was given and what he was providing before, he needs to boost his numbers back up a little bit as well. Another player, Boone Jenner, has been on a gradual decline for about 2 to 3 years now. 2 years back, he was a 30-goal scorer. Then he dropped down to 18 and then down to 13 this past year. So Jenner is a player they need to take a hard look at and see what they can do moving forward. Certainly somebody who would fall under the trade candidate for sure, and he needs a new contract, and we'll touch on that momentarily here once we jump into the offseason discussion. Now, another player who didn't really have a good year is Brandon Dubinsky. Only appeared in 62 games and put up 62 points. And he's got a pretty decent contract as well. So a lot of these guys, even Josh Anderson, you could throw in, was only okay. He was given a contract extension for a couple of years. He didn't have a terrible year, but I think they can expect a little bit more out of him moving forward as well. Some of these guys got their new contracts, and then their play just fell right off. So you don't really want to judge their characters, but unfortunately, this is something that happens a lot when you see players playing for contracts, and then afterwards, sometimes their play does tail off a bit. For some of these guys, it's just a lot of it. A lot of these guys that have a bad year at the same time certainly just didn't bowl well. So from an offensive perspective, they did okay, but it's certainly a big area of focus moving forward for sure. Now, as far as some contracts, let's jump into the offseason here. Let's look at their UFAs and their RFAs. They don't have a ton of each, but they certainly have some interesting decisions to make for sure. For some of these UFAs, they have really 6 guys that are notable. They got Thomas Vanek and Mark Letestu, who both came over at the trade deadline. Ian Cole also was a trade deadline acquisition. You got Matt Calvert, Jack Johnson, and Taylor Chorney. Now, I think it's pretty safe to say that Vanek doesn't come back. It's definitely safe to say Jack Johnson doesn't come back. We know Jack Johnson requested a trade. Unfortunately, they were not able to deliver on that before the deadline. So that's something that he's going to leave via free agency because he wants more opportunity to play. That's a given. Calvert, it's certainly debatable if he comes back. Wouldn't be surprising if he didn't. Letestu, it's debatable as well. He can round out the bottom 6 forwards, and maybe on a short-term, lower, team-valued contract, maybe. I won't completely rule out Letestu. I mean, he's got a history there. And he may come back. He's a tough one to peg. Chorney's debatable. They probably could let him go. Ian Cole, I think, is the most likely out of all of these guys to return. I think he was a good fit there, and I can certainly see them making a good attempt at re-signing Ian Cole. The rest of them, it's iffy. As far as RFAs, they had some interesting ones here to look at. Like, as I mentioned, Boone Jenner is a restricted free agent. The way the production has gone for Jenner over the past 3 seasons with a gradual decline, but at the same time, he could probably use a fresh start. I don't think things are going too well for Boone Jenner in Columbus. He obviously has a scoring pedigree. He's proven that before, but he needs to be able to find that again. And I just wonder if he can find that in Columbus. I'm starting to think that that's not going to happen and that he needs to get a fresh start somewhere else. He was mentioned in trade rumors before during the season, and it would not be shocking if they were able to find him a fresh start somewhere else. As far as the other RFAs, we've got Ryan Murray, and Bjorkstrand as well. So they're probably both going to get new contracts. Hard to say exactly how long or how much, but they're certainly going to be qualified. So they have to take that into account here before they make any other moves. But the Blue Jackets aren't in too bad of a salary cap position right now. As of right now, they have about $13 million in cap space. But obviously, you mentioned, like, I'll look at all the guys that they have that don't have contracts right now. They don't need to replace all of them because they have more than enough other players in the organization, the roster, who can take some of those spots for sure. But if you factor in that they get assigned Jenner, Bjorkstrand, Murray, and Cole, for sure, you know, maybe one or two more of these guys, that's $13 million doesn't go very far. Then you factor in the fact that the cap's likely going up because that hasn't been officially announced yet. It's been discussed but not firm. Probably going to be around $80 million, so there's probably an extra $5 that they can throw in there. So they might have $18 million to play with, but they're going to have to sign 4 or 5 guys within their own organization already. Now, none of those guys are expected to get big money deals, but still, that's not going to leave a ton of money to go after free agents. So they need to be creative on how they can get some of these contracts off the books because they can dip into free agency. They really could, and they can go after some scoring wingers for sure. There's enough of them out there between free agency and on the trade front that they could certainly bring in, you know, look like a guy like a James Van Riemsdyk or a Jeff Skinner or a Mike Hoffman or, you know, any of those guys that are kind of fast skating scoring wingers. There's plenty of them that seem to be around that could be for sale that they could go out and either sign as a free agent or make a trade for. They definitely need to add some more secondary scoring. Obviously, they can't just clear out the second, third, and fourth lines, but they need to hope that some of these guys can bounce back and get better next year, and they could probably shake things up a little bit as well. I mean, if you look at their special teams and look at all the guys that struggled, I just don't see how they can come back with the same roster next year and expect to have the same level of success without making some changes to, at the very least, tweak some things for sure. I mean, this team looked pretty solid. I mean, before the season started, I thought they would contend for the division lead. They at some point in time did. I mean, they had Columbus has been a streaky team really the last couple of years. They've had some times where they were very streaky on big winning streaks. But even with all that in mind, you know, they still have their streaks where things don't go so well as well. So, I mean, personally, if I'm the Columbus Blue Jackets, I look to shake things up and add some secondary scoring. You're pretty solid in goal. You know, they have a pretty solid back end, at least with your top pairing. Your 3-4 spots aren't too bad as well between Cole, David Savard. You know, they have some other depth players there as well. Their defense isn't too bad. And they have a good goaltender. And their top players, like Panarin, for example, and even Dubois, and even if Atkinson can finish strong, he's one guy I have more faith in the rebound. You know, they can get that line going. But then, you know, they have a lot of other guys that I mentioned that really have been on the decline for their offensive production. And there's no way they're all going to bounce back. So they need to figure some things out and make some moves that way. Now, of course, at the NHL Draft coming up here soon, they hold a number 18 selection in the first round. So that is a pick that they should be able to get a pretty decent prospect at. It doesn't matter if they want to go with a defense or a forward. I mean, really, for them, I'd probably go with a forward if possible at this point. They're not too bad on their back end. They really could use some more help, I think, up front. Now, whoever they select likely would be a year or two away. But depending if they want a center or a winger, they could probably go in either direction, really. I mean, they might want to take a center, considering they don't have a ton of depth at that position right now. But, you know, it's something that, like I said, whoever they select is going to be a year or two away. They might want to look at it like a Rasmus Kupari. They could look at a Rasmus Sandin if they want to really look at on the back end. If they want to grab a center, like Kupari's a center, they might be able to get Joe Velino as well. Velino is another guy. They're kind of hard to predict. Same with Kupari, where they're going to end up going in the draft. There is plenty of prospects that should be available at that number 18 spot. They should be able to get a decent player there to kind of add to their prospect cupboard and potentially add to this roster in a year or two's time. Your thoughts on the Columbus Blue Jackets? What should they do this offseason to really make this team better for next season? Like I said, they really need to boost some secondary scoring and hope some of these guys bounce back, because there's only so many things they can do with the roster they have with all the contracts. But they need to do something to boost their scoring and their special teams, because their special teams were just not good enough at all this past year. Amazing they made the playoffs having such a low ranking PK and power play. It's not something you see very often. Normally you have to be in the upper half of the league in both those categories, or at least one of them, to really stand a good chance of being a playoff team. And they didn't do that, but they still made the playoffs. So I think in a lot of ways we see Bobrovsky kind of masking some of those things that they're not so good at. I mean, he is a pretty solid goalie, and you know, a lot like some other teams, when you have solid goaltending, sometimes it can hide some other weaknesses. And I think that this team is certainly one that falls into that category. So if they can cover up some of those weaknesses on their own, take the pressure up Bobrovsky, that's what they need to do in order to take the next step forward to be a more solid contender and have a chance to finally win their very first playoff series since they've been an NHL franchise. If you're new to the channel, I hope you consider subscribing. We cover all 31 NHL teams. There's plenty of content here for all hockey fans to enjoy. So if you're new, hit that subscribe button. Hit that like button as well if you like this video. I'd really appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you very much for watching, everybody. We will catch you next time.